Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Persistence Outdoors podcast. It's Samuel Allred on the mic. Thanks for tuning in, or perhaps clicking in if you're listening on Spotify or Apple Music or any of those platforms. I guess we don't tune in that much anymore. But thanks for being here. I went skiing last week, and there was some great fresh snow. It was near an area that I went bear hunting in the spring. And the whole time while I was skiing, I was looking at these north slopes. And north slopes are significant because they tend to get a little bit more snow than southern facing slopes, or at least they retain more snow because they don't get as much sun generally. So north slopes often make good ski hills. They sometimes have dense timber as well. So I'm looking at these north slopes as I'm taking the lift up, and all I can think about is about the bears that are denned on the north slopes. Bears like to den for their winter nap on north slopes, and then the snow will come and fall on top of their den, and it helps to insulate them. And they'll spend the whole winter there until the snow starts to melt. So this whole time I'm skiing and going up lifts, I'm thinking about, I wonder if I'm skiing over some bears right now, and they're just not even aware of it. I would guess that the bears probably aren't bedded in those more popular ski areas with lifts and easy access, but who knows? There could be a bear down there, and it's just covered under 15 feet of snow and people are just skiing over it. You know, that one jump you go off of, maybe it was originally a bear. Who knows? But I find it interesting that bears can just den down. They can dig out a hole, or they can get in a big pile of brush, and they can take shelter for the entire winter that way and be just fine. Personally, if I were stuck out in the woods with no shelter and I had to find a way to survive the winter, I'd be a little bit worried. But thankfully, as humans, we have shelters that we can bring with us when we're camping and hunting in the backcountry. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Different shelter systems and some of the advantages and disadvantages of each system. For the purposes of this episode, I'm going to focus on what I consider to be the more common and accessible forms of shelter. What I mean by that is shelter that most people can afford, and shelter that you can transport without a vehicle like a four-wheeler or livestock or something like that. There's some really cool shelters out there like hot tents and wall tents, but those may be out of the budget for the average hunter, including myself. So today we're going to focus on tents, tarps, bivy sacks, and just camping in your car. Before I get into it, I'd like to ask, if you've enjoyed this show, if you've learned something, please take a moment and rate the show 5 stars on whatever platform you're listening on, and then follow the show so you can get notified when new episodes come out. It's actually pretty easy. They come out every Tuesday, but those ratings and follows will help the show grow, help it get in front of more people through the different algorithms. So I really appreciate those good ratings and follows. With that, let's start with the most common and maybe the most well-known shelter system out there, and that's a tent. If you've ever gone car camping, if you've ever slept out in the backyard with friends when you were a kid, if you've ever gone backpacking, you're probably familiar with a tent. And tents are super versatile. They range in size from one-person tents to giant Franken tents that you see at the state park. There's a whole family in there, right? They can be used for backpacking. They can be used for hunting. They can be used at lower elevations. They can be used on the side of mountains. I mean, tents are super versatile And that's one of the things that makes them so popular. They're basically a entire shelter system wrapped up into one package. So once you have your tent up, you have some protection from bugs, from rain, you have a little bit of warmth, you have some wind protection. It's all right there, and it makes it super easy and versatile. When you're looking into tents, you'll find that there are two main distinctions: 3-season tents and 4-season tents. 3-season tents are suitable for spring, summer, and fall trips. They provide, like I said, some protection from bugs. They're waterproof, and they'll give you a little bit more warmth than if you were just sleeping under a tarp or under the stars or something like that. They're not designed for winter conditions, but they will do a good job in almost any conditions besides that heavy snow or heavy winds. 4-season tents, on the other hand, are built for harsher weather, including heavy snow and high winds. They're more durable. They're made with thicker poles and stronger materials, and there will be less mesh built into the tent body for ventilation because they're imagining that you want to stay warm, and that mesh can generally make you cold. So they're a little bit warmer, and they will be heavier duty and heavier weight than 3-season tents, but they're suitable for extreme weather conditions. So if you were going to go climb Mount Rainier and you wanted to stay at Camp Muir, you might want a 4-season tent, just depending on the conditions, because then you could set up your tent, and even if there was a lot of snowfall, your tent wouldn't collapse. And these tents are often built in a way that helps them withstand heavy winds. So hopefully your tent also wouldn't blow away or break a pole in the wind. There's a whole lot of factors to consider when choosing a tent. I'm going to spend a little time on this because so many people out there are going to use a tent at some point. So it's nice to know what you should look out for. The first thing I look for when choosing a tent is the rain fly. I want a rain fly that extends to the ground or gets very close to the ground. Poor rain fly coverage could lead to water soaking through the walls of your tent or getting in through the mesh of your tent. You'll see all sorts of tents that are sold at Walmart, and they're for car camping, and they will have a tent body and then just a tiny little rain fly at the top, and it looks kind of like a hat, maybe a little umbrella for the tent. And it's cute, but it's not that functional, because if it starts to rain badly, the water can drip from the rain fly onto the body material of the tent or onto the mesh, and all of a sudden you're going to have issues with getting wet, getting soaked through, condensation, things like that. So I always look for a rain fly that extends all the way or close to the ground, and that way when it rains, the water will run straight to the ground and not into your tent and onto you. When you're checking out the rain fly, it's also good to look for different attachment points for guy lines. The little lines that you can run off the tent to pull the rain fly taut and make sure that it's not touching the tent body. It also helps by pulling the rain fly taut to direct water where you want it to go. And it helps in high wind situations so your tent isn't flapping annoyingly all night and keeping you up. The next thing that you might look for is ventilation. If you are choosing a 3-season tent, it's likely that you'll want some mesh panels to reduce condensation in the tent and allow some airflow. A lot of tents will have a zipper or something where you can zip up a layer of material in front of the mesh panel so that you can control the airflow and also the warmth. More mesh will make your tent a little bit colder, of course, but generally that ventilation is a good thing. Without those mesh panels, what happens is you're breathing out all night and there's vapor in the tent and it warms up And then there's the cold air on the outside of the tent material. And what you'll get is condensation. And in bad cases of condensation, that water can roll down and get in your sleeping bag, get on you, and it just makes the tent experience not as enjoyable. And if there's enough condensation and you're in a down sleeping bag or something, that could compromise the warmth of your sleeping bag. So having some ventilation is usually a good idea. The next thing I would look for are good zippers. Zippers are one of those things that give out on tents before anything else. So unless you want to be dealing with a zipper trying to replace it or something like that, I would get something that has good zippers. If you're reading the reviews and everybody's like, the zippers go out, that's going to be very annoying. What will happen is you'll think, oh, well, the tent is still mostly functional. And then every time you try to get in or out of the tent, it's going to have a little fit. And then every time you're trying to close the zipper, it won't close all the way and it will let cold air in, or it will be flapping in the wind or something like that. So make sure it has some good zippers. You'll just have to read the reviews or read the specs to determine that. Another thing you might look for are sealed seams. The tent is going to have stitching and be made up of multiple different pieces of material, right? And those stitching, those seams can be places where water can get in. So the best tents will have some sort of sealant. It's kind of like a little tape that's melted on, something like that, over these seams to keep water out. And that way you won't have water dripping through your rain fly or the body of your tent. A final thing to consider is the setup. Does it look like it's an easy design? Is it intuitive? Or is it not? There's lots of tents out there that could perform decently well, but they have a complicated setup, and it's just going to be a pain every time you try to put it together. So the best tents are going to have a fairly simple design, not too many poles, not too many pieces, and that way, when you go to set it up, it's not going to be a hassle every time. I like tents that have just 2 poles that cross, makes a rectangle, works every time. It's quick. You can set it up as one person or easily with 2 people. Another thing that I like to look for are tents that have clips to attach the body to the poles. So you lay out the body and then you put up the poles and then you just clip the body to the poles instead of trying to run a pole through a sleeve that then pulls the body up with it. Those sleeves just get annoying because they will catch the end of your tent pole, and then if they're really long, you'll have to snake the pole through while keeping the pole together. So you have to keep it under tension because it's made up of multiple parts that fold down, right? They're just not worth the effort. And over time, they start to fray because of how many times you've put that metal piece through that sleeve. So if you can find a tent that doesn't have that sleeve for the tent poles, that's just going to be a better experience overall. So those are some of the things you may want to look out for when choosing a tent. There are other factors, of course, but I think those are some of the main pain points that I've experienced. Let's talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages of a tent as your shelter system. So like we talked about before, it's a complete system. If you have the tent, it's ready to go and it will function basically to its highest capacity, being a 3-season or a 4-season tent, just as it is, right? You need to set it up correctly, but it's all there. You've got the bug netting, you've got the rain fly, you've got the poles, etc. So it's all there, makes it very simple to think about as a unit. Most tents are made to shelter more than one person. There are 1-person tents out there, but I think a 2-person tent is really the best bang for your buck because it's small enough to fit in a lot of places. You can use it as a 1-person tent if you want to. You can also bring a friend along. So it's very versatile. It's not too heavy if you're just backpacking or hunting by yourself. And there's a lot you can do with it. Tents in general protect you from bugs, which is really nice depending on the season. I remember when I was living in Tennessee, I could be out in very warm weather where I didn't need a lot of warmth from a tent, but having that mesh bug protection was invaluable. I can also think about being here in Idaho. Some of the seasons, like spring bear hunting season, there are quite a few ticks around, so it's nice to have that bug protection. Tents can also provide some warmth. They're not going to be the warmest thing out there, but they can provide some warmth, especially if you have multiple people in that tent together. Has some body heat in there. Tents keep out some dirt and debris. You have to be careful that you're not tracking in dirt or debris on your boots, of course. But if you're cognizant of it, you can keep a tent pretty clean on the inside. Tents are freestanding. You usually don't need any other equipment besides what comes with the tent to set it up. And it usually sets up the same way every time. So if you learn how to set up your tent, you're good to go. You don't have to think about rigging it a different way every time. Another thing that I really love about tents are vestibules. Vestibules are the compartments that are formed by the rain fly going from the top of your tent all the way down to the ground. And it makes this little compartment between the tent body and the interior of the rain fly. So to either side of your tent, if you have a rain fly that goes all the way down to the ground, you can have 1.5 feet or 2 feet, however far out it goes, a vestibule space. And in these compartments, you can put your backpack or other gear, and it doesn't have to be inside the tent, but it is protected from the elements. I really like those. It's just a nice feature when you're out backpacking or camping. Now, some of the disadvantages of tents are that they can be heavy compared to the other shelter systems we'll talk about. They have poles, right? They have multiple layers of material. So you have the tent body, and then you also have the rain fly, and then you may have a ground cloth beneath that. So they can be heavier just as an entire system than something like a tarp or a bivy. In fact, they will be heavier than just a tarp or a bivy. You also need some space to set up a tent. So you can't just pitch it anywhere. You kind of have to find a place where there's enough room between trees or a flat enough space on a slope to pitch this tent. And sometimes that can be hard, especially if you have a couple people in your group and you all need to pitch tents and you kind of want to pitch them near each other. Sometimes there's just not that flat or wide enough space to do that. So you either have to clear out an area to pitch your tent, or you have to go find a different place to set it up. And finally, tents have more setup required than a bivy sack, arguably less than a tarp, but more than a bivy sack, or even just using your car to sleep in. Usually it's not that bad, but some tents, like we talked about, can be very complicated and tricky. So that kind of just depends on the tent. I think the beauty of tents are that they are so versatile. I've used the same type of REI half dome tent for car camping, for backpacking, for hunting, for overnight trips on Mount Rainier in the snow. It's all the same type of tent, and it worked equally well for each of those applications. It wasn't even a 4-season tent. It's just a 3-season tent, and it did the job in each of those scenarios, kept me dry, kept me warm enough. I had enough room for my gear, and it's all with the same system. So I think that's the beauty of a tent as a shelter system. It just handles so many different situations so well. My recommendation, if you're looking for an all-rounder tent, is that REI half dome. So many people have used it. It's well designed. One little trick you can do with the REI half dome tent, and I'm sure tents that are designed similarly, is to get a ground cloth that fits the tent. Then you take the tent and set it up with only that ground cloth and the rain fly, and you just exclude the tent body altogether. And it creates a more lightweight shelter system that starts to behave like a tarp, which is our next system that we're going to talk about. When I'm referring to a tarp for a hunting or backpacking scenario, I'm not talking about the blue tarps that you're thinking of, the blue tarps that might be used for utility purposes that you throw in the back of your truck. Not one of those. I'm actually thinking about something that's much lighter and waterproof and more packable, something made from a material like sil nylon, sil poly, even Dyneema, but not the canvas or plastic polyethylene blue tarps that you might be more familiar with. These tarps made from those lightweight waterproof materials can be strung up using poles like trekking poles and paracord, some stakes. They can be strung up to make a very lightweight shelter. And it's mostly about protecting you from the rain, but they can also add a little bit of warmth and wind protection as well, depending on how you rig them. These tarps are often paired with a ground cloth. Sometimes it's another piece of sil nylon or something like that. I've seen people use just a piece of Tyvek as their ground cloth. And that way you can put your sleeping bag and sleeping pad on something not just in the dirt, and then have your tarp over the top of you. Tarps are also sometimes paired with a hammock or a bivy, just depending on what sort of sleeping system you have. But putting a tarp over a bivy bag can offer some extra protection, and it's a great way to protect your hammock. There's a couple things you want to look for when choosing a tarp. One of the main reasons people use tarps for camping is because it cuts back on weight. So the first thing you need to consider is whether your tarp is actually doing that for you or not. A blue tarp isn't going to save you that much weight just because they're kind of a thick woven material, right? But if you can find something made of a lightweight, waterproof, durable material, there is a good chance that it's going to weigh a lot less than taking a whole tent, for example. You'll also want to find something that has a lot of different attachment points. Kind of like we were talking about with the rainfly on a tent, it's helpful to have these different attachment points so that you can rig your tarp in different configurations and keep it tied down and taut once you've actually got it set up. With a tarp, it's not freestanding, right? So in the different places you camp, you may have to rig your tarp differently depending on the trees available or the terrain or even the weather. So it's helpful to have lots of different places where you can tie some paracord, and the only way you can do that is by having little loops sewn into the tarp material in strategic places. You also want to pick a tarp that's big enough for you. A lot of people on the internet, just after doing some research on this, a lot of people recommend at least a 9 by 7 foot tarp. A tarp I've used in the past, I think it was 9 by 9 feet, and it was good. It could fit maybe 2 people under it. I wasn't rigging it that creatively, usually just sort of as an A-frame. So get something that's big enough for you. If you can, go test it out, kind of see how you like to rig it and what makes sense for you. It's better to get something that's a little bit bigger than too small, and you find that out in the middle of a rainstorm or something like that. So make sure it's big enough for what you need to cover, and then also the configurations that you're likely to use it in. You may also want to find something that has reinforced corners and seams. So if it has any seams, just like that tent, some sealant over the seams, and then reinforced corners and edges where your guy lines, your paracord will be pulling away from the tarp to keep it taut. So let's talk about some advantages and disadvantages of a tarp. Tarps are super minimalistic, right? And along with that, they have very little protection from bugs. They won't trap as much heat, and they can be hard to rig, especially if you don't have much practice. So if you roll into camp and you need to set up your tarp quickly, say there's some wind or rain, it may be hard to set up your tarp efficiently because you'll likely have to find a tree or two to string some paracord between, or you'll have to balance your trekking poles with tension from the tarp and parachute cord. It could be different every time when you set up, and you're going to have practiced with it a little bit more to make sure that you can set it up in those tricky scenarios. Now, the advantages of using a tarp, though, are, again, that it's very minimalistic. It's very lightweight. It doesn't take up much space in your pack. So if you're really counting ounces, using a tarp and a ground cloth could be a way to save even a pound or two from your backpack. And over the course of your trip, not having that pound or two in your backpack, maybe even more depending on your other gear, those weight savings can add up and help you have more energy and less fatigue throughout the trip. Now, tarps are also a little bit more handy than a tent. You can throw them in your pack. They don't take up much space. And then you can whip it out if you need some rain protection when you're glassing, or maybe you need protection from the sun. You need some shade. You can make a open-sided shelter that you can sit in and glass, and then you can take it down and make an A-frame later for sleeping in. So a tarp has some added versatility. It is harder to rig because you have to make those decisions every time, but it also has more versatility. And with it being so light, you may be more inclined to carry it with you than carrying a whole tent wherever you go. Tarps are really nice for warm weather because they have all that ventilation and they're not going to trap heat the same way that a tent can. Sometimes you'll set up your tent and then go do something else and come back, and in the heat of the afternoon, your tent has warmed up a whole lot and you get in and you're just baking. That's not always a pleasant experience, but with a tarp, you're less likely to have that issue. So if you're in a more arid environment, you might get a tarp with some UV protection and go that way, and it will protect you from any rain squalls and also from the sun. And finally, tarps can be a little bit less expensive than tents. Not all of them, it just depends on the material that they're made of. But you can find tarps that are going to be less expensive than an equivalent quality tent. And that's nice. If you don't have a whole lot of cash to throw around, you could go the tarp route and be pretty happy with it. I think the best applications for tarps are when you're not too worried about that extra warmth, when you're trying to go light. You have plenty of options to rig your tarp, or you use trekking poles, and you know a way to rig your tarp using trekking poles and parachute cord, and you're not too worried about bugs. If you're in a situation where there's bad bugs or you really need that extra added warmth, a tarp may not be the way to go. Now, you can pair a tarp with other systems. So you could pair a tarp with some sort of bug netting or a bug bivy, or you could pair a tarp with a hammock. And then you have a different specialized system, right? At that point, you're not really getting all the advantages of a tarp being a whole lot lighter, because now you're adding different things, and at some point you may as well get a tent. But it is something to consider, and the modularity of a tarp paired with another sleeping system can give you more flexibility and adaptability for different scenarios. There's all kinds of tarps out there. The one that I used for a while wasn't the very lightest tarp, but it was good for what I used it for. It was a Noah's Kelty tarp, and it's pretty affordable. It's lighter than a tent. It had lots of different attachment points. So if you're looking for kind of a entry-level tarp, Noah's Kelty tarp, something like a 9x9 foot one would be a pretty good way to go. And you'll get a lot of use out of it. And you won't have to shell out a whole $300 for a tent. I think it's less than $100. So that's really nice. If you like the lightweight and minimalistic properties of a tarp, but you need a little bit more protection in the case of bad weather, you might consider a bivy sack. Bivy sack is short for bivouac sack. Bivouacking is just setting up a temporary camp. It's not meant to be long-term. I think it's often associated with big wall climbers and mountaineers who are bivouacking in a small space that may not have room for a tent, or only for a short period of time before they make their next ascent. A bivy sack is like a cross between a tent and a rain jacket for your sleeping bag. So often it will have a little bit of mesh and maybe one pole that goes over your torso or where your face would be. And it kind of keeps the material off of you in your sleeping bag, at least up towards your face. And then towards your feet, it becomes just more of a rain jacket for your sleeping bag. It's shaped like a sleeping bag with a little bit of extra room. You slide your sleeping bag in there, you lie down, and then you zip up the mesh and zip up the rain fly over your face and over your torso. The rain repellent bivy isn't the only type of bivy either. There's also bug bivvies and splash bivvies, and those are going to be made of a mesh material. The bug bivvy just to keep bugs out. A splash bivvy is going to also have some properties where if you set it up under a tarp, if water splashes in or if you get some rain that flies under the tarp, it's not just going to completely drench you, but it's not made for sustained rainfall or anything like that. Those bug bivvies and splash bivvies can be a lightweight addition to your tarp, so you can cast a low tarp and then put the bug bivvy underneath it. And now it's acting a little bit more like a tent, but without some of that extra material. So it can still be a lightweight option. When you're looking for a bivy sack, one of the biggest things that you want to look out for is a bivy sack that is made with breathable materials. If you think about wearing your rain jacket for a long period of time in rain, at some point, even if you don't get wet from the outside, at some point, sweat or condensation or other humidity can build up on the inside of your rain jacket and start to get you wet. And that can happen in a bivy sack. If you are completely zipped up in your bivy sack and you're breathing and there's condensation, that can all accumulate on the inside of your bivy sack and actually get you wet. So that's one of the biggest complaints with bivy sacks, is that they are not breathable and that they get clammy and uncomfortable after a long time zipped up. So the first thing that you want to look for is something that's breathable. A bivy sack that uses a material like Gore-Tex, which can allow moisture out while keeping the larger water droplets from coming in. And also bivy sacks that have strategic zippers for when it's not raining, so that you can let that moisture out and it doesn't have to accumulate. You also want to make sure your bivy sack fits. You need to be able to put your sleeping pad and your sleeping bag and yourself in the bivy and still be able to zip up and be comfortable. A third thing to look for is just the functionality of the bivy. Are you looking for something that will withstand rain or very cold temperatures? You'll need to make sure that you find something that's not going to soak through in a heavy downpour if that's what you could encounter. Oftentimes, these bivvies are made to be lightweight solutions, so they may not be the most weather resistant, just depending on the bivvy. So you need to make sure you understand what your bivvy is actually going to do for you, and whether that's weather resistance, whether that's keeping bugs out. You just want to be aware of that from the get-go. So let's talk about some of the pros and cons of using a bivy sack. One of the main advantages is that they are very lightweight and minimalistic. A bivy sack can weigh anywhere from 8 ounces to a pound, which is just so light, and that's not going to take up much space in your pack. So if you want the lightest pack possible, you might want to consider a bivy. Bivvies also have minimal setup. You just throw them down. You might put up one pole, and that's about it. And you can get in and go to sleep. They also have a very small footprint. It's just the space of your sleeping bag. So you can bivouac in your bivy sack almost anywhere you want to. As long as there's a place where you can lay down, you can use your bivy. So that's super helpful in thick forests, on steep slopes, all sorts of places where there might not be room to pitch a tent, or it might be challenging to put a tarp. You can put a bivy there and be just fine. Now, the disadvantages are that these are one-person only systems, so there's not a lot of room in there, and you might not be able to cover up your gear either. You might not have a place to put your backpack or other things that you don't want to get wet. Like we talked about, a lot of bivvies have breathability issues. It's just very hard to avoid condensation. This actually reminds me of being in Boy Scouts as a kid. We had a trip where we would go up on Mount Rainier and build igloos, and we would just stay for one night usually. So what we would do is bring a blue tarp and then put that in our igloo, put our sleeping bag on the blue tarp, and then fold the blue tarp over it. And that was just meant to keep melting snow and melting ice away from our sleeping bag. Well, it worked fine, but usually what would happen is condensation and moisture would build up anyway. So I had a synthetic sleeping bag, and I would make this tarp burrito. That's what we called it, a tarp burrito. And I would slide in and I'd sleep fine. But when I woke up, usually some of my sleeping bag was wet. My synthetic sleeping bag still kept me pretty warm, and it was fine for one night. But if I had to do that for multiple nights in a row, there's a chance that my sleeping bag would never have dried out, and then it would get cold, and then I'd come back and try to go to sleep, and I'd likely be cold, right? So that's kind of the issue with these bivvies, is that it might be okay for a night, and you might be able to deal with the condensation for a short period of time. But if you have to deal with it for a longer period of time or do it multiple times in a row, it can really become a big issue. So the breathability issues with bivvies are a big disadvantage. I think the best times to use a bivvy are for shorter trips. So if you're going out for just an overnight trip, using a bivy, even if you get a little bit wet from condensation, or if it's not the most comfortable, you'll probably be okay, and you're not going to have to deal with it night after night after night. You may also pack a bivy as an emergency shelter. This is a really good option when you're going out and you may be going somewhere where there's not a lot of other people around, but you don't plan to be out there for a long time. So if you're just going out for a day hunt and there's not going to be a lot of other people around, you might pack a bivy as an emergency shelter just in case you have to stay out there longer than you expect. You might pack a bivy when you're spiking out from base camp. If you're elk hunting and you've got a wall tent set up somewhere, but you want to go hike 3 miles or 6 miles away from camp and hunt that area for a night, you might bring your bivy with the expectation that you're just going to go for one night or so. Bivvies might also be a good option when you're in places where it's harder to pitch a tent for whatever reason. Maybe it's steep. Maybe you hunt very thick forests and there's just not a lot of room between trees most of the time. You may want a bivy in that situation so you can just camp wherever you want to without the hassle of finding the perfect camping spot. And then finally, bivvies are good for when you are going ultralight and you're not expecting too much sustained rain. I keep talking about breathability and rain because if you're in a rainstorm, you're likely going to zip your bivy up so that you don't get rain coming in from the outside. But then that creates the problem of moisture not being able to get out as well. So in drier weather or when you're trying to go ultralight and you're okay with some of the disadvantages of a bivy, it may be a good option. If you're looking for a good all-around bivy, you might check out the Outdoor Research Helium bivy. A lot of people like it. A lot of people say it's one of the more breathable models. And it should be good for 3-season use. It's probably not up to those harder mountaineering tasks, but for hunters and 3-season use, it should be a good option to keep you warm and dry. It's also only 17 ounces, which is pretty great. You can find lighter bivvies out there, but the Outdoor Research Helium bivy will be pretty light while still being at a reasonably affordable price point. All right, so the last accessible option for shelter is your car. I camped in my 4Runner recently when elk hunting, and I thought it was such a great idea because for the most part, I didn't want to go extremely far away from roads. I was hunting with just one other person, and I wanted to be realistic about how far I could pack out an elk with one other person. So I knew largely I would be driving to places and then hiking in. And I thought, with my car, I will just drive to the place I want to hike in and I'll camp there. And that's how I'll do it for the whole week. And that way I won't have to set up a tent and then take down a tent. I can be super mobile. I can go where I need to go to find the elk, and it will be perfect. The car that I drive is a 4Runner, and it has just enough space in the back of it when you fold the seats down to sleep in it, but it's definitely not roomy. I'm not going to explain what you should look for in a car necessarily. I assume if you're going to camp in your car, you probably already have it. So let's just jump into the pros and cons. One thing that I like about camping in my car is that it feels super secure. When I shut the door, I can just relax. And it's different than a tent or different than sleeping in a tarp. It's a different feeling. It's not like you're in the wild. And that's part of the enjoyable and fun thing about camping in a tarp or in a tent. You do feel a little bit more connected to the natural world, right? But on the other hand, if you're in your car, you have a hard shell around you. You have lots of wind protection. It's a little bit quieter. You shut the door and you're done for the day. You're safe from the elements. You're safe from wild animals. And so there is a peace of mind factor there that is kind of nice. If you're in the back of your car, you'll also likely have a flat surface to sleep on. There's no bumps or rocks or anything like that. If you have room and the seats go down, or you're in the back of your pickup, whatever it is, you likely have a flat surface to sleep on. That's really nice. The main advantage I was looking for when I was elk hunting was to have no setup or takedown. I don't have to set up a tent or do any of that. And it did streamline my process for getting up in the mornings when I'm getting up super early and trying to be to my glassing point before sunup. It did streamline my process and I didn't have to think about all of that. And then finally, you've got some built-in lights in your car, which can just be handy sometimes, especially if you're looking for your headlamp. Now, camping in your car comes with a lot of disadvantages as well, especially if your car isn't specifically designed to do that. The first disadvantage is parking. You need some space to park, and you need to be able to park in a way so that you're not super sloped. And just depending on how big your wheelbase is, right, it can be hard to find a place that actually feels not super sloped when you lie down to sleep. So you need a place to park. It has to be off the road so other trucks can come through or whatever. And that can sometimes be tricky to find. Usually it's not that bad, but in some areas you have to keep driving until you find the right place to park. Cars also aren't really built to deal with condensation when they're not turned on. So once you close up your car for the night and you go to bed, you can wake up in the morning with lots of moisture on the windows. You can crack a window to deal with this problem and let some air flow through, but then what happens is you're letting in cold air, you could let in bugs, and cracking a window will also let precipitation in if it starts to rain or snow in the night. So that's a little bit of a downside. In my experience, camping in my car is not as warm as camping in my tent. I think it's just because it has more air volume on the inside of a car compared to a little 2-man tent or a backpacking tent that has kind of a low ceiling and not a whole lot of space in it. But often I expect my car to be a little bit warmer, and it just isn't compared to that tent. So that's another point against camping in your car. If your car is not big enough, it can be really cramped. It can be hard to get in and out, especially if your car doesn't have latches on the back doors, which can be annoying. You have to be careful about not setting off your car alarm when you get out, which is, one, just a bother, and two, it could frighten animals in your vicinity if you're camping that close to where you're hunting. The two biggest downsides of camping in my car that I've found are that it eats up a lot of space and it can start to get your car really dirty. So when I was elk hunting, I had a lot of things in the back of my car, and to sleep in the back of the car, I had to pull some things out and reconfigure the area back there so that I had a room to put down my sleeping bag and my pad. Well, doing this every evening and reconfiguring and putting a seat down and then trying to drive around with loose stuff in the back of my car got pretty annoying pretty quickly. So it may not be the best idea to use your car as your shelter unless you can really designate space to actually laying down and not have to move around things every single time you go to sleep. The other thing was that every time I got into my car and then trying to change and take my boots on and off in the back of the car, I was tracking in mud, tracking in dust. I was touching the ceiling and the windows and things like that. And all of that contributed to starting to get the car pretty dirty, and then also putting little scratches and dents and things like in my ceiling or in the molding in the back of the car. And so that's all annoying. It's kind of, some of that wear and tear is going to happen over time anyway, but I prefer not to put more in my vehicle if I can. So it wasn't really ideal in a 4Runner. It may work a lot better in a truck with a topper or something like that, where it's all hard and you could wash it out pretty easily. But in a car like a 4Runner where you're putting down the seats and you've got some carpet and things back there, the cumulative effect over a week wasn't ideal. I think if you're going to camp in your vehicle, it's best for shorter trips where you don't have a lot of stuff, or if you have a truck or van with plenty of space. So again, if you have a pickup truck with a topper and you can dedicate some space to being able to lie down, that could be a really nice system. It's maybe not going to be as warm as a tent or some other systems, but if you have a good sleeping bag, you'll probably be good to go. If you're in a smaller vehicle that's not designed with some space to sleep, where you have to reconfigure seats or move things around, it's going to get old very quickly, and it may not be best for longer trips. All right, well, I hope this has been helpful for you, especially as you start to think about tarps and bivy sacks. You realize there are a lot more options for shelter than just your basic tent. And when you're thinking about going further into the backcountry, when you're thinking about doing multiple day trips, having these lighter weight options can be a huge advantage, especially because of the weight they're saving you. That said, if you're a beginner or just looking for a shelter system that you can get the most mileage out of, almost every time I would recommend that 2-person backpacking tent. That REI half dome is just going to give you so much flexibility. It's generally light enough to bring on so many different adventures, and it's affordable. So if you're looking for something that can do it all, I would probably bring it back to that 2-person tent. But then if you're a little bit more adventurous, if you're a little bit more experienced, if you have specific needs, then you might start looking into those lightweight tarps and bivvies. Personally, I'm a little bit torn between taking a tent or a tarp for bear hunting season this year. My biggest concern with bear hunting season is that there's usually lots of ticks. And while I'm not too afraid of ticks in general, I don't like them, and I just think about them getting to me while I'm sleeping, and it'd be nice to be able to have that bug protection from ticks with a tent. Otherwise, I plan to be doing a lot of hiking, and it would be nice to save a couple pounds by bringing a tarp instead of a whole tent. So I haven't quite decided what I'm going to do, but that's what I'm considering at the moment. I think that's all for today, guys. Thanks so much for supporting the show. Get out and ski or snowshoe over some sleeping bears, and I will catch you next week.